So you're seriously telling me in The Legend of Zelda, fish people turn into bird people to escape a flood, and we're just okay with this explanation? Come on!
So I know I'm a little late to the party, I'm actually very late to the party, but even Nintendo haven't got round to elaborating on this Breath of the Wild 2 trailer, and I only just started making Zelda videos here on this channel, so let's talk about them Sky Islands. Hey Hyrule heroes, Berkey Patobi here, and Sky Islands. I know the theories are already out there. We've seen Sky Islands in the world of Zelda before, right? We've seen them in Skyward Sword, that would make sense. Skyloft, it's a giant island in the sky. The whole game it's set in Skyloft. It's a big part of the game. Twilight Princess features the Uka, a really bizarre race of creatures that are the closest to the gods, and they live in their sky city where there's a whole temple. And if you're really niche and you know your Zelda, then you know in the Minish Cap, the Picori, were originally said to come from the sky, giving the hero of men a blade that came from the sky, and in fact, the Wind Tribe even lives in their temple above the clouds. So you already know the theories. You don't need me to come in here as a complete Zelda theory noob and tell you that these Sky Islands appeared in Wind Waker. That's right, these Sky Islands that we see in Breath of the Wild 2 appeared in my favorite Zelda title, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. I can tell by the fact that you might already be down in the comments getting ready to go that you're maybe a little bit confused, so let's talk about these sky palaces and castles and temples, because throughout the 3 previously mentioned games that we've seen them in, they're always referring to a place that is above the earth, both physically but also metaphorically as well. In reverse order, for your ability to enter the Wind Temple in Minish Cap, you have to meet and learn about the Wind Tribe, who use their magic to elevate their palace to the clouds. And the original Picori people, they handed down this blade that was able to thwart the evil that is Vati after forging it with the 4 elements. This is a pretty special place, but it becomes more clear in Twilight Princess, where, as I mentioned, the Uka, and similarly in Twilight Princess, the Uka are thought to be beings of magic closest to the gods, closer even than the Hyruleans. And in fact, similarly, I think the Loftlings are always thought of as being closer to the gods than any other race, even the Hyruleans. They are, after all, the chosen creatures of the goddess Hylia, and this fits in perfectly with what we're seeing in Breath of the Wild 2, with these golden trees and Shinto-styled gates, which, as far as I'm aware, represent a barrier, a jump through the realm of the mortal to the realm of the sacred, closer to the gods. We also know that these sky cities are often separated from regular Hyrule by way of other magics, including the cloud barrier, which is a magical barrier that protects it from sight and allows it to remain hidden. This cloud barrier also seems to exist in Breath of the Wild, where we can see the mythical dragons Dinrol, Farosh, and Naydra disappearing up into the skies, going somewhere which we've now seen in the trailer for Breath of the Wild 2. Awesome, you were all already on that page. What the heck am I talking about when it comes to Wind Waker? Well, Wind Waker has a particular connection to Breath of the Wild, and this first came up, and I first got thinking about this when watching MaskedNintendobandit's video on the subject of what happened to the Great Sea. Now, no matter what you think about timelines and timeline placements, there was a great flood that occurred before Breath of the Wild. I think it's pretty much assumed that all Zelda games happened before Breath of the Wild. They're all delegated to the time of legend. But throughout Hyrule, we can find the rock salts that kind of represent the fact that there was a standing body of water across the entirety of Hyrule at some point or another. That's standing water, which means, yeah, it was all flooded. But on top of that, we had also seen the Koroks, who had evolved from the Kokiri, and the Rito, who had evolved from the aquatic Zora as a result of the flooding. They evolved specifically because of the conditions met by a great giant flood that happened everywhere. And sure enough, those races exist in Breath of the Wild as well as in Wind Waker, implying that Wind Waker must have happened at some point before. No matter what you think about the timeline, I think that's pretty indisputable. But fine, okay, great, Toby, so Wind Waker happened before Breath of the Wild. Where are these Sky Islands? Okay, fine, I'll tell you. Do me a favor, jump in the King of Red Lions, set sail across the Great Sea, and head to any island you like, let's say Windfall. Now make your way to the highest point on that island and look up into the sky. Look out, and maybe you'll see them. Oh, hang on, I'm confused. You're looking the wrong way. Don't look up, look down. At the island below your feet, that island is one of the many Sky Islands that is going to be appearing in Breath of the Wild 2. Okay, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Fake Zelda fan, let's get him out of here, shall we? Except, did the explanation that we get in Wind Waker really make that much sense? Hyrule was in danger by Ganon returning. The hero of time was gone into another timeline or another dimension as a result of Termina. We're not quite sure, but here's the thing. The people prayed to the goddesses, and the goddesses chose to flood Hyrule. And the people of Hyrule, their descendants, where do they flee? They flee to the mountaintops of Hyrule, and that's it. That's the explanation we're given. Except there's an island for every square mile of the Great Sea. And I've looked at the maps of Hyrule pretty closely, and the one thing that I don't see, there's not that many mountaintops. Ocarina of Time has one mountain, Four Swords Adventures, I guess one, maybe it's got a second one, I'm not sure. Minish Cap has Mount Colonel, and I think it's got another mountain on the other side, so I'm gonna give that one 2. There is not a version of Hyrule though, no matter where you look throughout the timeline, that has that many mountains. 49 mountains for 49 mountaintops. That doesn't make sense. But just look around you, open your eyes, see the conspiracy happening here, because yeah, sure, there's a mountain or two underneath the Great Sea that seem to protrude through the sea barrier, but even Ganon's tower doesn't go that high, and in the distance, mountains that are as tall, if not smaller than it. If we were truly seeing Hyrule underwater as it is with the Great Sea, with all of these mountaintops, we would be seeing mountains absolutely everywhere. But that doesn't line up with what we see in every other Zelda game, and it doesn't even line up with what we're seeing underwater in the Wind Waker. So the question is, where are all these islands coming from? And the answer is simple, they're not coming from anywhere. They are where they have always been, in the skies above Hyrule. It is simply the water that has elevated to that level. Now, I'm not saying that the residents of Hyrule did not flee to the mountaintops. Clearly, Dragon Roost Island is the top of Death Mountain, and I'm sure there are other locations, perhaps the temples of the sages, the Earth and Wind Temple, that are also mountaintops. And I believe that is where people started, but then when the waters rose, they began to travel across and discover these new lands provided by the goddesses who flooded Hyrule. Think about it, would have been a pretty cruel joke on the goddesses' part to flood Hyrule without lands for these people to travel to, and sure enough, we know that throughout the history of Hyrule there have been these floating lands protected by the goddesses. But what's a good theory without a little bit of supporting evidence? And this is where we're going to talk about those races, the Koroks and the Ritos. Because something else that's never sat right with me is the idea that the Zoras would evolve into birds as a result of the flood. And I know what you're going to say, saltwater, freshwater, river Zora, sea Zora. Except we've seen Zoras live in salt water. We see it in Termina. They're absolutely fine out there on Termina Bay. And in fact, it's the river Zoras in other games that tend to turn into something else. The Zoras wouldn't have a problem living in the Great Sea. They would actually have advantage over most of the other races, but they'd have even more of an advantage if they could fly from island to island back when they were still Sky Islands. And there's actually evidence in the Wind Waker that suggests that this is the case. I was watching Zeltik's video about Volvagia, the sort of missing elemental deity of Ocarina of Time. We see the Deku Tree for the Kokiri, we see Jabu Jabu for the Zora, but the Gorons don't really have a deity spirit. Well, they have Volvagia, but Volvagia eats them and was at one point dead but resurrected by Ganondorf. Likely the fact that it's so aggressive towards Gorons is the result of Ganondorf's curse, much like the parasites that infect Jabu Jabu and the Deku Tree. But the way that these deities tend to work in Zelda is that while they aren't special godlike beings, they still have a sort of life and death and reproduction. We see this in Ocarina of Time with the Deku Tree sapling, and then of course in the Wind Waker we're likely seeing the Great Deku Tree's sapling all grown up, or perhaps it's the Great Deku Tree's grandkid, grandsprout, grandroot, family trees. And similarly, we see a descendant to Volvagia in the Great Velu, who not only sits atop Dragon Roost Island, but also who is directly responsible for the evolution and change of the Zora into Rito. We know that in order for a Rito to fly, they must get a feather from Velu. They need Velu's blessing. That's the kind of power that Velu has. And while I can't find a source, they say there's about a century between Ocarina of Time and the Wind Waker. That is a very quick amount of time for a fish to turn into a bird. It's a very condensed amount of time. The only way it could do that really is with the help of the gods and goddesses and various spiritual creatures. It's likely that Velu aided in the Zoras becoming the Rito. But why would Valoo help the Zora and not the Gorons? We see in the Wind Waker that the Gorons are almost completely absent from Hyrule, or rather the Great Sea, with only 3 of them being around as lone merchants and their family members and relatives being far away in New Hyrule. They've almost gone completely extinct from this area of the world, I suspect as a result of some kind of feud between the Zora and the Gorons in the post-Hero of Time world. A world in which Ganon was returning, Jaboon was likely in hiding, and the Zoras saw an opportunity to be rid of the Gorons, whose architecture can be seen throughout Dragon Roost, and in fact there in Dragon Roost we can also see a snake-like dragon that looks a little bit closer to Volvagia than it does Valoo. And it's likely in the same way that the Hyruleans appealed to the goddesses of the Zelda world, the Rito appealed to this Valoo-Volvagia in-between. First traveling to this creature by way of the grapple hook and creating grapples that look a lot like Volvagia's claws to appeal to it and beg to be transformed, because they knew that while dominion over the sea would be great in the event of a flood, dominion over the skies would be useful after the flood receded, and still allowing them to travel from island to island. Of course, in the Breath of the Wild we see Zoras too, so it seems like not all Zoras were on board with this plan, but at least some were, and they became the Rito tribe. But certainly being a bird would be a lot more useful in a time where all of our islands are floating in the sky. Of course, one day the floods did recede, leaving Hyrule covered in this salt rock-like substance, and the Sky Islands disappeared back above the cloud barriers, leaving the people of Hyrule to forget, to leave it to the time of legend. But they'll never know what we Hyrule historians know, that back, once upon a time, those islands were home to all of the people of the Great Sea of Hyrule when it had to ascend to the mountaintops and live above the waves. Huh. And you know what? That actually adds even more credence to the fact that it's called Wind Waker, and so much of the game is about the relationship to the winds and the skies and the aerial elements, as much as it is the sea. But I know, I'm new to the Zelda theorizing space, all my theories are wacky, just like the one I did about Tingle, which you should definitely check out. Tingle, absolutely a time god. I'm really enjoying doing these kind of off-the-wall Zelda theories, so if you like them, maybe share them in some other Zelda theorizing communities, because I definitely want to do a bunch more. And I'll definitely be keeping my eyes open in the run-up to Breath of the Wild 2. Thank you all for watching, and of course, soar high, Hyrule heroes.
Wow! Yay! Hop! Yup! Including...
A huge thank you as always to those of you who are supporting me on Patreon, including the big patrons of this month, Jed Rubin, Michael Hornchew, and Lucas Gates. Thank you guys.